Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey. Not with me, as always, co-host extraordinaire Timothy Richardson. Don't worry, folks, Tim's just fine. We've just both been traveling a great deal this month, which is a shame because it is, of course, the month of October where we celebrate every year our Spooktober Spooktacular. So don't worry, there's still plenty more to come, and as Tim insists every year, the holiday will be extended well into November and possibly December, and if I have anything to say about it, not January. Tim will be back next week, ready to give you that sweet, sweet Spooktober Spooktacular extravaganza you've been waiting for. But until then, I wanted to hold everybody over, give you a quick Proof of Life podcast. It's just a solo cast, but in staying with the theme, in case you hadn't seen the title, and I don't know what I called it because I haven't figured one out yet, I put together 3 stories. And these 3 stories are tragic, they're filled with murder, and all of them influenced songs that later became hits. Except for one that never became a hit, but we'll talk more about that at the end. So we'll be back next week doing all our fun, normal podcast goodness about albums and singles, why we hate them or don't hate them and why. But this week, instead, I'm going to present you guys with a story, and then at the end, I'll reveal what song it influenced, give you a little clip. As always, you can reach out to us on all the socials. It's HatePod on Instagram, Album HatePod on Twitter. I'm G Harvey Tweets. Tim is, well, he refuses to let anybody follow him. So I won't bother. We're on Discord, we got subreddits, all the things. So if you want to find us, you can, hatePodMail@gmail.com, hatepod.com, Google us, you can find us, and please, we want to hear from you. So please do reach out with your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, and general feedback. Business out of the way, folks, let's get into it. I've got 3 wild stories for you, and I gotta be honest, I want to warn everybody, especially the 3rd story is particularly, it's aggressive. It's got stuff that, as I was writing it, I found pretty repulsive. So, if you're queasy, if you're not of the holiday spirit, that is the Spooktober Scaretacular, you might not, just keep your finger on the fast forward button. 15 seconds will usually do you. There's only a few parts that are particularly disturbing. But warnings out of the way, I hope you enjoy these stories. Took me a while to put them together, a lot of fact checking. Turns out most people on the internet are liars, and I'm trying not to be. So, without further ado, I give you 3 dark tales about murder, mayhem, and tragedy that inspired popular songs. A WIHTA solo cast original. Seasons don't fear the reaper, nor do the wind. In 1986, living in Salado, Texas, Raymond Howard was a widower in his 70s. He had resigned himself to a life of solitude, and that is, of course, when he met Leela. A widow herself, the two fell in love and were soon married. The next 10 years were a gift, and the couple didn't waste a day. Every summer, Leela and Raymond would pack up the Oldsmobile and drive 15 miles from Salado to Temple, Texas, for their favorite Fiddlin' Festival. And in June of 1997, that's exactly what they set out to do again. It was a 15-mile trip the two had made every single year, and Leela would be driving. This was despite objections from Leela's son, who had begged to drive both his mother and father instead, but Leela declined, saying, quote, "No, we know where to go. We go there every year." Leela's son's concerns stem from the fact that his 83-year-old mother was showing signs of Alzheimer's, getting easily confused without warning. A very recent incident occurred at a local Walmart. Leela was meant to show up for morning coffee at 10:30 a.m., but instead arrived at 10:30 p.m. and was incredibly confused when no one was there and the sun wasn't out. 88-year-old Raymond was in even worse shape to drive. He was recovering from a recent brain surgery following a head injury that had triggered a stroke. But Leela and Raymond, stubborn and blinded by their own severe mental decline, left for the festival that morning without even telling their adult son, who lived just next door, that they were headed out. The afternoon passed and the Howards didn't return home. The kids began to panic a bit, but when a greeter at a local Walmart in Temple remembered seeing Leela and Raymond coming in for coffee on Thursday afternoon, everybody began to settle down. However, that still didn't answer the question, where were they? Eventually, the many children between the two had become worried enough to actually contact authorities, and a missing persons bulletin was posted that day. 3 days later, Wednesday, July 2nd, without any word from the couple, a newspaper article was published in the Austin American-Statesman titled Elderly Salado Couple Missing on a Trip to Nowhere. It read, quote, Leela and Raymond Howard are on a 4-day trip into thin air. The Central Texas couple, in their 80s, with diminishing health, somehow have turned a 15-mile journey for a cup of coffee and a party into a 500-plus mile misadventure with no known destination. It would seem the couple had disappeared, but on the very same day that article was published, a deputy in rural Arkansas pulled over Leela Howard for driving without her headlights on at night. Leela and Raymond were 500 miles away from their original starting point in Salado, Texas. The deputy later noted that Leela was polite, gentle, and, quote, acted just like my grandmother. When Leela stated that they were trying to get back to Texas, the deputy noted that they were headed in the exact wrong direction, and so he gave them directions to head back to the state. The deputy then asked Leela where she lived, but she couldn't answer that question. Completely satisfied, this deputy led an elderly woman he pulled over for driving without her headlights on at night, who was trying to get back to Texas but was driving towards Mississippi, and even if she were to get to the gigantic state, couldn't tell him where she lived. He just let her go on her merry way. He asked all the right questions, got the exact wrong answers, and then said, well, you have yourself a great evening. Luckily, the couple was pulled over again about a half hour later, this time for driving with their high beams on. However, this deputy asked 0 questions and also let them go with a warning, ignoring the fact that they were entirely disoriented and probably had no business driving a car anywhere. However, neither of the deputies knew that they were talking to missing persons, and the Howards once again disappeared. The next day, on July 3rd, there was another article about the Howards. They had allegedly been spotted at a farmer's market in Arkansas, and authorities in 11 states were on the lookout. On Friday, July 4th, another article stated that authorities had narrowed down their search to 3 specific counties in Arkansas. While the children waited to hear updates, they went to their parents' home only to realize the true extent of the couple's mental decline. There were folded clothes lying on their bed as if they had started packing for their trip and then forgot what they were doing. The television was unplugged and hearing aids had been left behind in the bathroom as well as various toiletries. Even though the month was currently July, the Howards' calendar remained on February of the same year. And most notably, the Howards' beloved cat Happy had been left behind with no food or water. Realizing the severity of the situation, the search intensified as authorities employed dozens of deputies, carefully combing obscure back roads and brush areas, posting flyers, and questioning everyone around the area. At one point, helicopters were even used in the search, and the investigation area grew to 1,000 miles from Salado. By then, one of the Howards' grandsons had even put up a rather measly reward of $1,000 for his grandparents' safe return. Tips came flooding in after the CBS morning show did a story on the missing couple, but none of them led to the Howards' discovery. By Thursday, July 10th, expectations were low, with one of the Howards' grandchildren remarking in a newspaper article, quote, "The hardest part is thinking that they are suffering or need us and we can't get to them," while another bleakly stated, quote, "I just don't think we're going to find them alive now," end quote. Everyone's worst fears were finally realized on Saturday, July 12th, when the bodies of Leela and Raymond Howard were discovered in their car by hikers at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff just outside Hot Springs, Arkansas. Raymond was still in the passenger seat, but Leela was absent, having crawled 20 feet away into a ravine, still clutching her purse and car keys in her hands. Apparently, after the car went over the cliff, she put it in park, turned off her headlights, opened the passenger side door for her deceased husband, and crawled away to die. There were no skid marks found on the road on top of the cliff, indicating that Leela's car had driven straight off the edge, as though she didn't realize that there had been a turn, or possibly fell asleep. It's not known for how long the Howards' bodies remained undiscovered. Sadly, the crash site where Leela and Raymond's bodies were found were within the zone previously searched by authorities, but searchers just couldn't see through the brush. Leela and Raymond were recovered eventually and later buried next to their respective first spouses, as they had declared in their wishes. But that's just half the story. While all this was going on, Austin, Texas songwriter Tony Scalzo read the July 2nd newspaper article in the Austin American-Statesman in the midst of the search for Leela and Raymond, and he became inspired. He wrote a song with his band Fastball based on Leela and Raymond's disappearance. You might have heard it. It was titled The Way. About the song, Scalzo said, quote, "It's a romanticized take on what happened," end quote, noting that he wrote the song before the Howards' bodies were discovered, hoping the story would end with a positive outcome. The album containing The Way, titled All the Pain Money Can Buy, was released in 1998, 1 year after the Howard's bodies were found. And if you weren't around or you were too young to remember, that song was pretty fucking popular when it came out. And so if you were listening to the radio, you probably heard it. Meaning that there is a very good chance the children of those poor people got in their car and collectively heard the following lyrics. They made up their minds and they started packing. They left before the sun came up that day. An exit to eternal summer slacking. Where were they going without ever knowing the way? And had to wonder, at least for a second, is this about my parents? Did this guy write a song about how my parents died in a ravine? And they'd be right. In 1969, Sherman Kelly was living a dream life. A recent Cornell graduate, he was living in the Caribbean, playing music in various bands, and running a nightclub in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, with a group of friends and fellow musicians. One day, they decided to rent a 65-foot yacht and travel to St. Croix for the day. Somehow, Kelly, an island resident, did not know that he was prone to seasickness. Both he and his girlfriend spent the entire boat trip with their heads hung over the edge. I suspect they were probably hungover, given that it's very strange that two people would both become seasick, but maybe they just never left the island. Anyway, when the group got to St. Croix, they all took a dinghy to shore to look for some dinner. But Kelly and his girlfriend were both still fairly sick and no longer had any interest in eating. After the group got its food, they decided to head back to the boat and spend the night. Kelly and his girlfriend looked out at the harbor, seeing the boat's masts swaying back and forth, and opted to stay in town overnight rather than risk an entire evening of being seasick. So everyone except Sherman and his girlfriend got into the dinghy, promised to retrieve the couple in the morning, and return to their giant anchored boat in the harbor. Excited to shower and get some sleep, Kelly and his girlfriend decided to check into a hotel for the evening. But it wasn't until they were at the motel itself that they realized neither of them had any money or ID. Since they knew they wouldn't be eating, Sherman's wallet and his girlfriend's purse were left behind when they took the dinghy to the island. Hoping to find sympathy, they explained their situation to the hotel manager and promised to pay him in the morning when their friends came to pick them up if he could supply them with a room. He, of course, said, "Absolutely, no problem, you can stay here if your girlfriend will have sex with me." Not sold on the deal, the couple decided to leave. After being turned down again at a second inn, Kelly's girlfriend suggested, "Hey, it's a beautiful night, why don't we just stretch out on the beach?" So they did. And according to Sherman, quote, "And that's all I remember very clearly," end quote. What happened after that was largely pieced together through the recollections of others. According to those accounts, while sleeping on the beach, Kelly and his girlfriend were the victims of a vicious St. Croix street gang. Kelly was severely beaten by 5 gang members wielding baseball bats, and his girlfriend raped by their gang's leader. Allegedly, the other attackers were lining up for their turn when Kelly regained consciousness and began attempting to fight back. Though physically feeble with multiple broken bones in his face, he was making enough noise that he managed to scare the attackers off for fear that they would gain too much attention. With Kelly drifting in and out of consciousness, the two managed to follow the lights along the shore to the only St. Croix hospital. It's believed that Kelly and his girlfriend were among the very first victims of the notorious Fountain Valley Gang. And folks, this is where I have to hit pause. So we're going to hear all about Sherman Kelly and the rest of this story in just a minute. But when I read Notorious Fountain Valley Gang, I had to know what the hell that meant because they're not that notorious. I've never heard of them. Let me explain. We're going on a side quest. Stick with me. It's worth it. So it is widely believed that the 5 dudes that attacked that couple on the beach might have been, though I kind of doubt it, the same 5 people responsible for what was known as the Fountain Valley Massacre. This massacre took place on the afternoon of September 6, 1972, 3 years after their beach beating at the Fountain Valley Golf Course in St. Croix. 5 Virgin Islanders, led by Ishmael Labit, killed 8 employees and tourists and wounded several more. All 5 men were apprehended on multiple charges of murder, assault, robbery, all under Virgin Island law. And during the trial, 2 of the defendants claimed that it was just supposed to be a straight robbery. They were going to go to the golf course, rob the wealthy golfers, but Labit insisted that they execute everybody so that they could make a political statement about the exploitation of the local peoples. All 5 were, of course, found guilty and sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms. Several appeals were filed unsuccessfully, and throughout the process, eventually the leader of the gang began claiming that he not only didn't commit the shootings, began claiming that he had nothing to do with this incident, hadn't participated in the shootings, let alone been the instigator of the entire massacre. Then, after sitting in jail for about a decade, on December 31st, 1984, Labit, then calling himself Ismail Muslim Ali, hijacked American Airlines Flight 626 while in federal custody on a transfer to a new detention center. Using a handgun stashed in the lavatory by what I assume was a dirty guard, he forced the pilot to land the plane in Havana, Cuba, where this dude Labit escapes. They never capture him, ever. But with the thawing Cuban-American relations around 2015, before everything got, turned to shit, Labit was confirmed to actually be at large in Cuba. He was in jail for a little bit when he first got there. No one could say how long or exactly why, but he is currently living in Cuba and remains on the FBI's most wanted list. So if it was the same group, it sounds like Sherman was lucky they only had bats and he managed to scare them away. Anyway, I found that story weird and interesting, and since it was about more murders, I figured why the hell not include it, right? It's a Spooktober Spooktacular. Let's get spooky. Now, let's get back to Sherman Kelly. Before the tangent, Sherman had just limped with his girlfriend to a hospital before collapsing into a coma. Sometime later, he was wrenched awake by disembodied screaming. Quote, "I woke up to the sound of my hospital roommate screaming in pain," said Kelly. "Finally, the screaming stopped and I heard 2 doctors talking about him." "That's it. He's gone," said one doctor about the screaming man. "What about him? You think he's gonna make it?" the other doctor replied. And the first doctor said, "Nah, I doubt it." And that's when Kelly realized they were talking about him. He had multiple facial fractures among other serious injuries, but he did manage to survive. After spending several days at the St. Croix Hospital and recovering at a friend's house on St. Thomas, Sherman returned to New York. Doctors at New York Hospital rebroke and reset all the bones in his face and addressed his other injuries, before he returned back to his home in Ithaca, New York, still in pain and with constant headaches. Kelly had no interest in touring with any bands anymore, but that didn't prevent him from writing songs. It was during this period of convalescence that he began to write some verses for a new song based on this horrific beating. But rather than focus on the negative things that had happened, he used them as motivation to write a song about the world he hopes to live in. Quote, "I envisioned an alternate reality, the dream of a peaceful and joyous celebration of life. It was just me imagining a better world than the one I had just experienced in St. Croix." End quote. And when he finished, Sherman Kelly had written the now hit song, Dancing in the Moonlight. He turned an unspeakably traumatic experience that almost cost him his own life into a classic American song. In 1970, finally recovered from his injuries and interested in performing, Kelly joined a band called Boffalongo with his brother Wells Kelly. Dancing in the Moonlight appears on their 1970 Boffalongo album called Beyond Your Head with Sherman on lead vocals. Kelly wasn't pleased with the vocal performance. Quote, "The first time I was in the recording studio for that version, we had these producers who thought it was a good idea to give me cocaine. That was probably the worst idea. I found myself in the vocal booth where there were a lot of people distracting me, and the producers would just give me more and more cocaine to get me to keep doing takes until my voice was so distorted it sounds like somebody else." End quote. Still, that version did become popular and Boffalongo had a regional hit, but it was just that, a regional hit. So when Boffalongo broke up, Wells Kelly joined the Paris-based French-American group King Harvest. Their lead singer was Doc Robinson, also formerly of Boffalongo, but it was Wells Kelly who introduced Dancing in the Moonlight to the band. The King Harvest version featured Robinson on lead vocals and was released as a single. It languished for almost a year before catching on and climbing the US charts. Once the song became a hit, King Harvest even invited Sherman Kelly to tour with the band in the summer of 1962 so that he could perform his song. During the live shows, Robinson handled the lead vocals while Sherman provided the harmony. But a life on the road with King Harvest wasn't for Kelly. He lasted just that one tour with the band. Now, Sherman did continue to write music, mostly with his brother, until he would die in 1984. Sherman then stepped away from the music writing process to get his master's in social work and psychotherapy from Syracuse University, where he would then practice for the next 30 years. But here's what's really crazy. Well, all of this is pretty crazy. But here's something I didn't know. The King Harvest version of this song was just a drop in the bucket in the royalties department compared to what would happen in 1999. You see, the King Harvest version of Dancing in the Moonlight, at least the one that I thought was most popular, turns out not so much, it peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 and sold a few 100,000 copies in the 70s. However, English band Toploader released a cover of Dancing in the Moonlight in February 21st, 2000 as the third single from their debut studio album, and this version would go on to become 4x platinum. And while I do think the cover is objectively worse than the King Harvest version, I am pleased that Sherman Kelly's song does get to live on, it finds a new audience, and he probably got some pretty solid checks, all by staying positive even when life literally is beating you down.
Everybody was dancing in the moonlight.
Issei Sagawa was a short Japanese man at just under 5 feet tall. His hands and feet were small, and his voice was higher pitched than the other boys at school. He had been born prematurely and just never seemed to catch up. Early on in life, Issei felt inadequate compared to his peers, and those inadequacies quickly evolved into strange impulses and later desires that he simply could not ignore. They began as early as first grade, when Issei, an avid reader, saw a photograph of the inner thigh of an adult man in a book he was reading and was overcome with the urge to eat it, the first of many new urges. Later, he would also commit acts of bestiality with his family dog that I'm not going to go into detail about because it makes me very sad and I wish I had not read it. These urges continued through his childhood, but he largely was able to ignore them or suppress them. Finally, around 1973, while studying English literature at Wako University in Tokyo, he became attracted to a German woman who was teaching him the language. Quote, "When I met this woman in the street, I wondered if I could eat her," end quote. So one summer's day, he crawled through her apartment window to at least cut a little piece off and maybe even kill this girl. She was asleep in her bed, scantily clad, just as Issei had fantasized, but there was a problem. He didn't bring anything to cut off a little piece with. Standing over his intended victim, he searched for something to knock her out with or stab her, and eventually spotted an umbrella. But before he could act, the woman woke up, began screaming, shoved Issei to the ground, and he scampered out the window. Sagawa was captured within the next day or so and charged with attempted rape. Now that should be the end of the story, but Issei's parents were rather well off, so his family paid the victim a settlement and the charges were dropped. I don't know if this is how Tokyo justice works now, but that seems kind of fucked up. I think if there's like a crime committed, you shouldn't be able to just pay a fine. I don't know. Anyway, Issei was able to lay low in Tokyo while he finished his master's after that close call. And in 1977, at the age of 28, Sagawa moved to France to pursue a PhD in literature at the Sorbonne in Paris. While there, Sagawa began to indulge in his darker urges, quote, "Almost every night I would bring a prostitute home and then try to shoot them. But for some reason my finger froze up and I couldn't pull the trigger," end quote. It wasn't until 1981 that Issei met his Dutch classmate Renee Hartevelt, a woman he thought so beautiful that he just had to have her. And by have her, I do mean consume her body. And by I mean him. Sagawa believed he loved this woman and that by consuming her he could show it. So he began to make his move. He sat next to her in class and fell instantly in love, obsessed with her milky white arms. His words, not mine. He knew she was perfect for what he wanted, but this time he had to be more careful. Renee was 25, blonde, independent, and spoke 3 languages. She was studying to receive a PhD in French literature. So Sagawa asked her to teach him German, offering to pay well with his wealthy father's money. A student herself, she of course accepted. And honestly, Renee enjoyed spending time with Issei. He was smart and could talk about anything from impressionist paintings to Shakespeare. Issei, for his part, would write her love letters, invite her to concerts, and take her dancing. She found him engaging and a great friend, but as we all know how this sentence ends, with the dreaded, quote, "I just don't like you like that." Or if you're a Dutch woman and blunt as hell, quote, "I do not find you sexually attractive," end quote. That didn't really matter to Issei anyway, since his whole goal was to possess and destroy her. Again, his words, not mine. One day in late August, Issei invited Renee over to his apartment for dinner. He asked her to read a poem by his favorite German expressionist. She somehow didn't find this incredibly strange, recited the poem, and then decided to call it a night. After she left, Issei began licking the chair where she had sat, and in that evening he vowed to consume her. Why he would tell anyone that he licked a chair that somebody sat in is beyond me, but things are about to get way worse, so I guess a little chair licking is just kind of par for the course. And again, folks, this is where we're going to hit the pause button just so I can say to you all, things are about to get a little extreme. So if you're a sensitive listener, just hover over that fast forward button. Still using the lame poem excuse, Issei invited Renee back over to his house on June 11th, 1981, so that he could record her reading this rad German expressionist poem she was so good at reciting. This time, Sagawa had prepared for everything. He had purchased a .22 caliber rifle for, quote, self-protection. He seated Renee on the floor to drink tea, and laced her tea with whiskey to make her more pliant. Although, this part of the story seems very strange to me because I think you would instantly know if somebody put whiskey in your tea, having had both. One is not masked by the other, but apparently not Renee. And if you think about it, it's 1980s France, so there's probably a good chance they're never not smoking, and probably couldn't taste anything anyway. Any whoozleby, they talked as Sagawa waited for the whiskey to take effect. Then, when she was feeling a bit tipsy, he told her that he loved her and wanted to take her to bed. Renee said, "No thank you, let's just be friends," even in her inebriated state. Issei, for his credit, or delusion, instantly shook off this brutal rejection and pretended like nothing had happened. Instead, Sagawa nodded, got up, and retrieved the poetry book. He handed it to her to read while he started the recorder. As Renee read the poem, Sagawa snuck up behind her with his rifle and shot her in the back of the neck. Renee fell over instantly and became unresponsive. Surprised by the silence, Issei noticed the blood flowing from her wound. At first he tried to clean it or stop it, but eventually gave up, realizing things were about to get a lot more bloody, so why bother? He undressed her with difficulty, not realizing how hard it is to move dead, or in this case, dying, weight. But Issei still did not hesitate. With her clothes off, he finally indulged in his deepest desires. He cut off the tip of her left breast and a piece of her nose, consuming both. He attempted to bite off her right buttock, but found it too difficult. He compared her muscle and fat as he carved it off her body to raw tuna melting in his mouth. He was ecstatic in the moment, noting later she was his forever. Issei next got out the electric carving knife to cut Renee into pieces. He nibbled on a few raw pieces and then fried others in a pan with mustard, which is strange to me. I guess this is all strange, but why mustard? He took photographs of the mutilated corpse and, of course, had sex with it. As he continued to eat Renee, he listened to the poem she had read on the tape recorder before he shot her in the throat. As if performing for some unseen audience, Issei even claimed after the fact that he used her underwear as a napkin to wipe her mouth as he consumed her. The next morning, he enjoyed a breakfast of her blood while he chewed her arm from the underarm to the elbow. According to Issei, the taste was, quote, amazing. Curiously, he then cut out her anus, but found the smell too overwhelming to eat. So he did what anyone would do, he fried it in a pan, but still couldn't bear the odor, and so, and this is very strange, he put it back. Which I read multiple sources that all called out that he put it back. There's no putting it back. You cut out her butthole. Oh, horrible. Anyway, very curious decision. Since it was France in the 80s and July, flies quickly began to swarm around the corpse. Realizing he had a bit of an issue on his hands, and all over his apartment floor, Sagawa used a hatchet to chop up the remaining body parts into smaller pieces and place them into suitcases he had recently purchased. As he dismembered her, Issei again got so excited that he used her dismembered hand in order to masturbate, which again sounds like sensationalism, but the man said he did it, and he did these other things, so who are we to judge? Oh wait, no. Who are we to assume he's not lying? We should definitely judge him. He then chewed on her nose for a bit, enjoying the crunch of the cartilage, but on midnight of the second day, he packed everything into the suitcases and called a cab. He intended to dump the remains in a pond at the Bois de Boulogne, which I think is the forest of Boulogne, I think. Anyway, he was going to dump him in a pond. But when people noticed him struggling with two very heavy bags filled with bloody sacks, he panicked and just left the suitcases open behind. A couple, very slowly but soon, approached these bags and saw that there was a hand protruding out of them and called the police. It took about 4 days to trace the suitcases of body parts to Issei, and during that time, he continued to eat pieces of Renee. When the police finally did arrive, Sagawa was in his home, eating Renee's flesh while thumbing through pornography casually. After being held for 2 years awaiting trial, Sagawa was found legally insane. Apparently, he was so forthcoming and detailed about the murder and subsequent meals that he was deemed unfit to stand trial by the French judge. The judge then ordered him be held indefinitely in a mental institution, which is probably accurate. The dude seems insane. However, after a visit by author Inuiko Yamada, Sagawa's account of the murder and its aftermath was published in a book in Japan under the title In the Fog. This created a very strange publicity and a macabre celebrity, leading the French authorities to deport Issei back to Japan to try to get some of the stink off of this horrible story out of their country and into somebody else's. Upon arrival, Issei was immediately committed to the Matsuzawa Hospital in Tokyo. However, his examining psychologist declared him sane. He passed all of the psychological exams. They found that he was, in fact, a sexual pervert with some sadistic tendencies, but instead they found that sexual perversion was the sole motivation for the murders. And since the charges against Sagawa in France had been dropped, the French court documents were then sealed and made unavailable to Japanese authorities. Meaning, through the weirdest and worst loophole in human history, well, French-Japanese history, Issei Sagawa, self-proclaimed cannibal and all-around not great guy, could not legally be detained in Japan if he didn't want to be. And so, Sagawa checked himself out of the hospital on August 12th, 1986. Not a social pariah, but instead from 1986 through 1997, Sagawa was frequently invited to be a guest speaker and commentator. In 1992, he appeared in the Hisayasu Sato exploitation film Uakizuma Chijokuzimi, I'm so sorry, which translates to unfaithful wife, shameful torture. He of course played a sadomasochistic voyeur, and by played, I mean showed up to set. The man wrote books, articles, commentaries, and even restaurant reviews. But that was until people started to get a little tired of supporting a sexual deviant, murderer, and self-proclaimed cannibal. As things were looking bad for Issei, he applied for a position at a French language school, and the manager wanted to give him the job, impressed that he had had the courage to use his real name. However, when other employees heard that he was about to be hired, they staged a protest, and he was rightly rejected. In 2005, Sagawa's parents died and he was prevented from attending their funeral, but did repay their creditors, causing him to move into public housing and having to receive welfare benefits for a time. And pretty much from that point on, Issei lived in squalor. In 2013, Sagawa was hospitalized from a cerebral infarction, which permanently damaged his nervous system. When he was released, he needed daily assistance, which eventually was provided by the state or his younger brother. It was not until this point, at the age of 63, that Issei finally admitted that he regretted what he had done and wished that he had not been driven by his desires. This monster would live with that regret for another 10 years, until November 24th, 2022, at the age of 73, Issei Sagawa died of pneumonia. Now, why did I tell you that story? Well, if I'm being completely honest, it is because Mick Jagger's a fucking liar, and he led me to believe one thing, and it turns out it's something else. Let me explain. You see, back in 1984, the world was fairly shocked and fascinated by the story of Issei Sagawa, including a couple of rock legends by the name of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. The two of them wrote the Rolling Stones song Too Much Blood based on this story. Sort of. You see, they claimed they wrote this based on that event, but that just couldn't be true because the song was recorded before the murder even took place. But that didn't stop Mick from saying, quote, "Well, there was this scandalous murder story in France. It was a true story about this Japanese guy who murdered this girl, and it sort of captured the imagination of the French public and the Japanese. The Russians wanted to do a movie about it." So that was the first bit, and then I started becoming more lighthearted about it and made it more movie-oriented. In the end, it came out sort of as an anti-gratuitous cinema of violence, and it's kind of an anti-violent thing. Now, featured on their 1983 album Undercover, released as the album's third single in December 1984, Too Much Blood is, and this is true, one of the worst Rolling Stones songs you've never heard of. It has Mick Jagger rapping, for God's sake, in 1984. I don't know why that's worse, but it is, because everyone was worse at rapping in 1984. God, he might have been par for the course at that point. Anyway, point being, the reason I told this story was because I had a vague awareness of it, and then I read that quote by Mick saying that that was the inspiration for this terrible, terrible song. So it fit the bill. Then I started doing some math, cross-referenced my sources, and I realized that he's a big fucking liar, because there's absolutely no way, given that the song was recorded before the murder even happened. However, I will say, one, I really enjoyed getting to tell this story, story. But 2, the music video for Too Much Blood is very strange. They tried to do a whole Thriller thing where the video's 3 times longer than the song, but they didn't have the budget or the talent, and the song is awful. And so it's all very, very embarrassing for everyone involved. I assume we'll be doing a spooktacular prepisode episode on it soon. Haven't talked to Tim yet. Not super clear where he is, to be real honest, but I'll find him. He always pops up. Anyway, so maybe this last story didn't quite fit the format of this episode, but it's not my fucking fault. I was tricked by Mick Jagger, so if you have nightmares tonight about a Japanese man slowly consuming you, blame him, not me.
Took her to his apartment, cut off her head, put the rest of her body in a refrigerator.
Okay, guys, that's going to do it for us this week. I hope you enjoyed it. 3 spooky tales and the songs they inspired. Well, some of them are more just violent inspired, and one of them didn't really inspire any of the songs at all. Jesus, these solo casts are getting real off the rails. Anyway, we're going to be back next week with your regularly scheduled programming. As I mentioned up top, Tim should be home, and my God, I hope he's been listening to garbage, because I know I have. Until then, though, please rate, review, subscribe, all those fun things. Let people know you enjoyed the podcast and however and wherever you found it. If you want to find us and we want to be found, you can find us at hatePodMail@gmail.com or go to hatepod.com and click on Contact Us in the upper left-hand corner. We've got subreddits, we've got Discord servers, we are on the internet. But until then, for this episode, next episode, and probably everyone to come after it, I have been one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey, and we'll see you next week for another very special Why I Hate This Album.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. The riffs are too repetitive. The lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides. The cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week. Now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.